time once again for Community Forum, and we're very lucky to have back with us live in the studios once again, Jonathan Grant. Jonathan Grant is running as a candidate for Seattle City Council Position 8, and he had formerly been on the show several times as his previous role as executive director of the Tenants Union of Washington. Jonathan, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us again this morning.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
So you are no longer with the Tenants Union.
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
You are running for Seattle City Council Position 8, which is one of the at-large positions.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us why you're running and why that position?
So in my time as executive director of the Tenants Union, I spent a lot of time doing community organizing, working with low-income tenants facing various housing issues. I worked on public policy at the federal, state, and local level. And I think that through that experience and through a lot of the struggles that I would watch as, families are being economically evicted out of the city, we would often turn to the city and ask the city council to intervene or pass legislation to actually address some of these issues. And, one of, my privileges was to work with Councilmember Nick Licata. And he really kind of demonstrated to me that there is a way to be a politician and still be true to your own values. And so when he announced that he was not going to run anymore and he was going to step down, it kind of occurred to me that we were really going to lose a champion for progressive issues. So I decided to step up and run for one of the citywide seats. Now, it's been a real adventure. I've never run for office before, but for the last 10 years, I've been an advocate in the community. So I've taken a lot of those lessons and a lot of those relationships that I've built over the 10 years with folks in the community to actually build a grassroots movement to win this campaign. I really pride myself on the fact that, this is a community campaign. This is, run by volunteers, and we've taken a pledge not to accept any contributions from any corporations or developers, because I think it's important that people in the community know that I stand with them and not with downtown interests.
And we should also point out that the person you're essentially running against now, after the field has been cleared a bit, is Tim Burgess.
Correct. So I'm running against our current council president. He's a two-term incumbent, and he's raised about $280,000 in campaign contributions. It's a pretty tall mountain to climb, but, I think it's important. And, I can give plenty of examples as to why I think that Councilmember Burgess is not the best person for this citywide seat. There's only going to be 2 citywide seats, and I think that one of those 2 should at least be in the hands of a solid progressive. So what I think I bring to the table is an alternative to the kind of incrementalism that we've kind of grown so accustomed to at City Council. Councilmember Burgess is known for introducing the Anti-Panhandling Ordinance, which is a law that would have essentially criminalized folks downtown who are homeless for asking for money to try to survive on the streets. And I think that's indicative of a value system that's out of touch with Seattle that I think is quite a bit more progressive than that. There's also lots of other concerns around affordable housing, and some of his biggest contributors are downtown developers. And I was a big advocate for getting more affordable housing out of the South Lake Union upzone back in 2013, when the city was essentially, selling off a chunk of its of the city to Vulcan. And there was an opportunity there to impose a fee on the development that was happening, and that fee would go towards funding more affordable housing. So the debate at the time was, how high can that fee be before we actually discourage development from happening? And the city hired an economist, and the economist said, well, we could charge an $85 per square foot fee to bring in tens of millions of dollars for affordable housing. So that's $85 per square foot. My opponent introduced legislation at $22 per square foot. That is a huge gap. And we essentially left tens of millions of dollars in revenue from the private sector that could have gone towards affordable housing in the midst of our worst housing crisis. And I think that you can draw a line between the downtown developers and their contributions to my opponent and his policy decisions on city council. And that's why I want to offer the city an alternative, that we can actually have independent, progressive leadership that is not beholden to those downtown interests.
During that 2013 discussion over the fees for South Lake Union, wasn't Nick Licata pushing for the highest fee during that time?
Yeah, Councilmember Licata was the one person who was really pushing for the higher set of fees. And my opponent is really quick to turn around and say, people voted for my proposal 8-1. And that's right. There was a vote 8-1 to support this proposal that got us less affordable housing. And I think that's why the ballot initiative to create districts and to essentially require all the city council members to run for their own seats, I think that's why that passed. I think that was a referendum on the moderates on the city council and the conservatives on city council. So we have this opportunity now, and I mean, look what happened. We have, a number of city council members who simply aren't going to even try to run for their own seats. So yeah, it was an 8-1 vote, and I think that people had a referendum on on those types of moderate decisions that weren't in the best interest of our community. And now we have an opportunity, for the first time in a generation, to have a true progressive majority on city council, and I think we should seize that opportunity.
And that opportunity being yourself running for city council, council member Sawant getting reelected, Lisa Herbold in District 1, and Michael Maddox, District 4? Is that right?
Well, I've not formally endorsed any
Sure.
candidate, but I think that those are some extremely strong progressive candidates that are currently in the field, that's for sure.
So since 2013, the mayor formed a committee, an advisory committee, over what we could do about our housing issues, problems here in Seattle. And you were actually selected to be on that committee.
Correct.
So talk about that a little bit.
Well, I was asked by former Councilmember Sally Clark to serve on the mayor's Housing Affordability and Livability Agenda Committee, or what's called the HALA Committee. So this was, as many folks know, a committee that is comprised of developers, tenants, housing advocates, et cetera. But the way they comprised the committee was inherently problematic, right? So they had half the committee be comprised of private developers or folks who represent those interests, and then the other half are, being advocates. And they said, we're going to have a process where you have to come to consensus, and whatever policies you come to consensus on, that's what's going to move forward. That essentially created a de facto veto by the private sector, right? So one of the things that advocates wanted was a robust linkage fee. Now, a linkage fee is a wonky term that is similar to what I was talking about before. It's essentially, if a developer is going to build a large apartment complex, they have to set aside some units to be affordable to working class people or middle class people, frankly. Right now there's an apartment complex going up in South Lake Union, and the rents are $6,000 a month. I'm not even making that up. So I think that, it's really clear that the private sector is not going to provide affordability on its own. It's something that we have to mandate. It's something that we have to regulate. And so the linkage fee was one way to do that. Now, if you were to maximize the linkage fee, that would bring in about $1 billion with a B over the next 10 years for affordable housing. The mayor's proposal that we ended up with, what's been called the grand bargain, that's around $600 million over the next 10 years. If you were to just look at the gross value of that. Now, I mean, that is, and we once again left, in this case, hundreds of millions of dollars on the table that we could be using for affordable housing in the midst of our city's worst housing crisis in our history. And again, they call it the grand compromise, but when you look at who was sitting at the table, it was a grand compromise with the developers. And what I would have liked to have seen is a grand compromise with the community, something that actually brought in the most affordable housing dollars that could actually truly address the crisis that we're facing. Now, that's not what we got. So I was the one person that abstained from the vote. And I didn't vote against it because I felt that this was better than nothing, but why couldn't we go for more? And I also wanted to demonstrate to the community that there was a wider spectrum of options than what was put before them. And I think that, if I get elected, that in some ways that might be a referendum on that process, right? Because since I actually put out my own alternative proposal to HALA, the same day that the mayor announced the recommendations, I went down to City Hall and said, this is a good start, but here's how much further we could have gone, and I think we should go.
And besides the linkage fees, what in proposal would you like to see happen?
So the proposal is very long. It's on my website at electjohngrant.com, as well as a number of other my policy proposals. I think that we need to pass that resolution to repeal the ban on rent control or rent regulation. So that's part of that proposal. I think that the city council needs to take that first step, otherwise it will never happen. We also need to have stronger tenant protections. One of the things that I'm fighting for is stronger just cause eviction protections, and that is a law that's on the books that the tenants union got on the books, where basically it protects you from arbitrary evictions. So a landlord anywhere else in the state can say, I don't like your haircut, I'm ending your lease. Here's a 20-day notice. In Seattle, you can't do that. And often it's not because of your haircut. It's, you complain about black mold in your apartment or cockroaches or something like that. I mean, there's a clear line to retaliation by the landlord, right? So, we have a problem with the law that's on the books where landlords can no longer arbitrarily evict you. But if you're on a term lease, there's this loophole in the law that you can drive a truck through that says that if the lease expires, you don't need just cause for that. You can terminate someone arbitrarily. So while I was at the tenants union, we got a bill introduced that's being considered by council right now. The political will may not be there because the landlords and the Rental Housing Association are so strongly opposed to it. And my opponent, Tim Burgess, also will not support this legislation, which is one of the key pieces of legislation that's out there right now to actually protect tenants from being evicted out of the city. He won't support it because one of his biggest contributors is the Rental Housing Association, which is the landlord lobby. Recently, the Rental Housing Association put out a newsletter that said that I would be their worst case scenario if I was on the city council. And I wear that as a badge. That's a compliment. And I think it says something, too, that they held a fundraiser, the landlord lobby held a fundraiser just for Tim Burgess to get him reelected. So I think that you follow the money. And I think that really makes it a real clear choice for voters in November.
So it isn't just high rents that are pushing people out of Seattle. It's also this intricate web of rules and laws that appear to be against those citizens that are renting.
Yeah, I think that's true. And, I've spent the last 10 years as a housing advocate, as a tenant advocate. I know those laws inside and out. One of the first things that I would do if I were elected into office is to completely rewrite entire sections of our municipal code to better protect tenants. There are so many loopholes and gaps and just straight up, absences of protections for renters in this city that we could fill. And we've never had somebody who's actually kind of lived and breathed that for a very long time be on city council. So I think that's something that, is when I'm going out in the community, and that's what's resonating with folks. It's that, we're in a housing crisis. People want someone who actually knows the laws, knows the policies, and knows what the options are actually out there to solve these issues. But it's also, not just about affordable housing. There's a lot of other issues that are facing the city, like around police accountability, for example.
Talk more about that, because we just saw this last week that our police chief fired an officer for the first time in a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I've made police accountability one of the central components to my campaign. It's born out of a lot of things. It's born out of my racial justice values. It's born out of my just being a human. It's just like you go and you watch these videos and you hear these stories of just clear examples of excessive force or racial profiling, and nothing happens. Now, while my opponent was the chair of the Public Safety Committee, that was the same time that the Department of Justice investigated the City of Seattle's police department and found that there were over 200 counts or 200 cases of excessive force and racial profiling. Not one of those officers were fired. Not one out of those, over 200 cases. And my opponent, he says that, he passed a few bills to address the issue and, to enable the OPA, or the Office of Professional Accountability, to take greater action. Why haven't we seen any action? It's been 8 years. He was the chair for 4 years. I think that there's simply not been enough done, and we have this incredible moment, this singular moment right now where we have the Black Lives Matter movement shining a laser-like light on this issue. We have mobilization here in Seattle. We have a new police chief. We have, the Community Police Commission that was formed as a part of the consent decree with the Department of Justice, all putting forward these proposals. And now all of a sudden that my opponent has someone who's a legitimate threat to him, he's all of a sudden in full support of the Community Police Commission's recommendations. And what I would say is, well, that's 8 years too late. You were the chair of the Public Safety Committee. You could have implemented many of these recommendations. So I think that, if we're going to actually, make any progress on this issue, we need somebody who's going to be independent from the Police Union Guild. And I would not accept any contribution from the Police Union Guild, and my opponent has accepted the maximum contribution from them. So I think that we have a real problem, and it means that we need to fully implement the Community Police Commission's 50-plus recommendations. It means giving subpoena power to the Office of Professional Accountability so that they can actually investigate and hold officers accountable where there are excessive force. And I was the only candidate to, publicly call out Cynthia Whitlatch, the officer who wrongfully arrested that African-American elder who was walking down the street with a golf club, and they threw him in jail, right? She threw him in jail. That was wrong. And before they fired her, I put out a public call to actually say, you know what? It is time for the city of Seattle to actually hold bad cops accountable and fire this person. And they should be entitled to all their due process and all their rights. But right now we have a system where you can actually appeal being fired in 3 different avenues. And one of the recommendations from the Community Police Commission is to make it a singular appeal process. So folks right now, they fired Cynthia Whitlatch, but she still has 3 bites at the apple, 3, to potentially get out of this being fired. And we could potentially see her being on the force again. And I think after the election is really we're going to really see whether that sticks or not.
One of the other items you have under police accountability on your website is eliminate the discipline review board. Can you talk about that briefly?
Yeah. So again, a lot of people talk about police reform, and this is an issue with my opponent. He's a former police officer himself, and he talks a lot about being data driven and using data to create better outcomes in the police force. And I think that that's fine. If we were talking about addressing hot spots in the neighborhood where there's crime or deployment and all that good stuff. But we're talking about accountability. That is a very specific thing. It means, what do we do with bad cops, officers who are actually fired for excessive force or for racial profiling, or that should be fired, I should say. So the Discipline Review Board is the entity that basically makes the decisions about who gets fired. It's 3 people, 2 of them are officers and 1 is a civilian. So that's 2 to 1. So it's not really a big surprise that very few officers are actually fired, because that is the process that they get in terms of determining their guilt or not as to whether or not they were committing these excessive force issues. And I think that that's a problem. I think we need to eliminate the Discipline Review Board and actually have greater civilian oversight so that we can have an impartial system that actually gets us towards a more accountable police force. And I think that this is a real problem with this city. If citizens can't trust the police force, we need to actually have an accountable system so that we can create a culture of trust between the city and the community, and between the police department and the community. And right now there's a culture of impunity, right? Even if somebody is being videotaped, that doesn't matter, because of the process that they go through, they're assured to be exonerated, right? Even if an officer is videotaped committing some form of excessive force. So that to me says it's not even about, getting body cameras or anything like that. We need to fix the accountability system itself, and that means eliminating the Discipline Review Board.
The Citizens Police Oversight Committee, isn't that a temporary structure?
So it was created temporarily as a part of the consent decree with the Department of Justice, and it was meant to essentially kind of advise the process from the outside and bring in the community to provide that input. That was something that Mayor Mike McGinn kind of innovated as a part of that reform process, so I think he should get credit for that. Now, there's this you're correct. It's supposed to disband after the parameters of the consent decree are satisfied. But there is a movement right now to have the Community Police Commission, which is this amazing body of extremely qualified folks from all sorts of different fields of expertise around issues surrounding the police. And we want to make the Community Police Commission a permanent oversight body. And I fully support that. I think it needs to get done. Right now, it's kind of unclear if there's support for that on the council and if that will actually happen. But I think that as a candidate, that's something that I'm going to push for.
I know the city has like a Human Rights Commission that's permanent.
Right. So there is the Human Rights Commission, and that they oversee like a lot of issues around housing rights violations and other issues like that.
So another issue on your site is campaign finance reform. Can you talk about that briefly?
Well, I'm an early endorser for Initiative 122, the Honest Elections Initiative. And this is something that I really hope folks will vote for this November. We have a real problem with money in our politics. A lot of people talk about or bemoan the Seattle process, right? It's this very deliberative process. It takes years to get anything done. And I don't think what people realize is that delay is a strategy, right? Slowing things down is a strategy. We kind of have become accustomed to think of it as a part of the Seattle culture and the way we get things done. But the reality is that we have had a city council for too long that is bought and sold by the Chamber of Commerce and the downtown interests. And so this process of, well, gosh, we need to go really slow and we need to, just incrementally address these things, that is a strategy of those interests to actually hold back progressive change, right? And I think my opponent is kind of the, kind of the head of that mindset. And now, if we were to actually have a system where our elected officials aren't totally beholden to the money that they get for running for office, we could have true progressive change in this city. So what Honest Elections Seattle does is that it actually, first of all, it caps the maximum contributions for politicians who run for office. And then it gives the rest of us democracy vouchers. And these are $100 vouchers, about 4 $25 vouchers that you can then give to any candidate that you want. And they did a study recently, and they found that a just infinitesimal, tiny fraction number of people who usually live on the waterfront properties of the city, those are the folks that give the maximum contributions to, to our city council members. So this would even the playing field. With court decisions like Citizens United, campaigns are just getting flooded with money right now. And, my opponent, again, he's raised almost $300,000 in campaign contributions. And these are all from the heads of, corporations, CEOs, developers. And for someone like me who's a grassroots candidate, I'm not going to accept those contributions. And I totally rely on smaller contributions from folks. But, it's a disadvantaged playing field. So let's level it. And that's what Honest Elections does, is it gives the rest of folks these democracy vouchers to actually support candidates that share their values. And it actually gives folks like me a fighting chance to actually win these elections.
All right. I believe it was just yesterday that you came out with a proposal, a solution to the gender pay inequity that is facing Seattle. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, but and it's terrible that Seattle is number one in the nation for gender pay inequity. And what does that mean? It means that for every dollar that a man makes, a woman makes 73 cents, even if they're holding the same job. And that is the worst in the nation of any other city. And there's many things that we can do to address that, and there's some glaring loopholes in the law. But one of the big things that I've put forward in this proposal that is, I think, different is that we actually are talking about implementing a 12-week paid parental leave program. The United States is the only country out of all the other developed nations that does not have paid parental leave as a part of its basic labor laws. We do have the Family Medical Leave Act, which is a federal law that gives you 12 weeks of unpaid leave, but it's unpaid. What do you do in that meantime, right? There are some local businesses in Seattle that have implemented 12 weeks paid parental leave, but it's very few and far between. It tends to be for higher income earners, and disproportionately, it's women and people of color who are working in lower wage jobs. So, what can we do for that segment of folks who are working in Seattle? And so we put forward, I worked with former council candidate Morgan Beach over in District 3, where she really changed the whole conversation, and she deserves a lot of credit for this, where she made gender wage inequity the primary thing that she wanted to focus on her campaign. So after the primary, where she didn't make it through, but she really changed the conversation. I sat down with her and I was like, let's actually do something that's big. Let's do something where we're going to actually expand this to the private sector, because previously the city of Seattle gave city workers 4 weeks of paid parental leave. Now, I felt that that's a great step in the right direction, and I think Councilmember Gene Godden deserves a lot of credit for that. But the kind of gold standard is 12 weeks. All the studies that are out there show that for a woman to re-enter the workforce and not be disadvantaged in terms of their employment options, they need at least that much time. And also, there are studies that show that children have less behavioral issues and have better cognitive results in testing if the parent is a beneficiary of 12 weeks. And it shouldn't just be women, it should be men too, because men need to be a part of child rearing as well. So this is a proposal it's the only proposal out there that I know that someone actually told or identified how they're going to pay for it. A lot of people say, yes, we need paid parental leave. Obviously, we need to do it. Of course, it's terrible that it's not the law. But I was like, okay, how are we going to do it? Let's actually find a way to do it. And so I proposed a business and occupation tax that would actually fund this benefit for low-wage for all workers, but in particular low-wage workers, where at the very least you would get a base stipend of $15 an hour to make sure that you aren't kind of out of luck if you want to start a family. So this is a really radical proposal. Again, on average, women earn about $16,000 less a year than a man, even if they're holding the same position. And this is a step in the right direction to try to close the gender wage gap. And I think that this is something that a lot of other council members are starting to talk about. And I think that that's great, because if a lot of those progressive folks get elected, this is something that we could really lead the nation on.
And we're pretty much out of time, but you also proposed a degree of transparency too, which people could look up on your website if they want to find out more details.
Yeah. If folks want to learn more about my campaign, just go to electjohngrant.com. I want to be a strong advocate and a progressive voice on the city council, and I think we have a real opportunity to push for true systems change. And I look forward to getting out there and meeting more voters.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us again this morning.
Thank you very much.